Sons and daughters of the soil, colleagues, and my elders, I greet you all in the divine names of our ancestors on whose shoulders we stand, whose blood runs through our veins, whose historical experiences are encoded in our genetic memory and in our collective consciousness. I greet you in the divine names of the Creator, our Maker. We in Africa are taught that when we begin every important work, we must begin by thanking Almighty God. And in Africa, we call our Creator by different names. And so I greet you in the names of Amatakatai, the name of Mvelingangi, Muari, Oshun, Ogun, Shango, Magano, Osa, Oset, Nyame. I invite the presence of our ancestors to be with us here, to guide us as we think, talk, discuss, and work towards our total liberation. Bantu Biko, who died chained hand and feet for an idea that continues to live. Muhumasa, the Queen of Uganda, who used African spirituality to repel the white foreign invaders. Umkhoputse Tiro, blown into pieces by a parcel bomb for inspiring black youth in the townships. Mbuya Neanda, who fought and defied the British in Zimbabwe, declaring that my bones shall rise again when she was hanged. Patrice Lumumba, humiliated, shot, chopped into pieces, burnt with acid, petrol and fire for daring to claim the Congo for Africans. Thomas Sankara and Amilcar Cabral, ravaged and butchered by bullets of betrayal. The warrior queen Taitu of Ethiopia, who, side by side, Emperor Menelik II, led armies of men against the fascist Italians and crushed them during the Battle of Adwa. We invoke your spirits, divine ancestors, and we invite your presence. Be with us. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event and our hosts, the Steve Biko Foundation, the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, the Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe Trust, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Thank you for inviting me to speak on a very important subject, decolonizing the education system and knowledge production in Azania. I'm here to argue a case for an Afrocentric epistemological revolution. I'm a history student at the university currently named after a criminal called Colonel John Hare, the University of Fort Hare. It is quite interesting to note that this university was a military post during the frontier wars which decimated African people in this part of the world, and was consequently named after the colonial criminal John Hare, who was the colonial administrator of the Eastern Province at that time. It is this historical consciousness which has driven some of us within the student movement to rename that institution UOS, the University of Sobukwe, in honor of the founding president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, who continues to languish in the solitary confinement of post-1994 national consciousness. I'm a member of the Afrocentric Study Group, a Pan-Africanist and African-centered academic society formed by black students early last year at the height of the ongoing Fees Must Fall protests. And on that note, I think I must say here that our minds and our hearts are with the students as we see all the events that are currently going on in the country, where I'm sure some of you have seen the video that has been circulating of what is happening in Rhodes. I mean, with all the flaws and all the weaknesses that our student movement has, but as students, we support the cause for Fees Must Fall. The emergence of the Fees Must Fall movement has brought to the fore a number of critical issues related to the current education system. One of the major calls of fees must fall beyond the free fees is a call for a decolonial education. We formed the Africentrik study group to deal precisely with and to focus our attention on this question of the decolonization of our education system. Firstly, let me explain what I mean by decolonization. For me, it is the process through which all Africans must be purged of the deeply ingrained Eurocentricity, low self-esteem, and self-hatred, as well as the process through which African people must regain and reclaim not only their absolute national sovereignty, but also their collective power and consciousness. Decolonization, therefore, means the rewriting and inscribing of African people on the pages of human history and civilization. One of the aims of the Africentrik study group is to wage an epistemic revolution against European intellectual and cultural hegemony and to destroy white supremacy in our university's curriculum. In the Africentrik study group, we are not interested in knowing what, in the Africentrik study group, we are not only interested in knowing what schools teach, but we are also interested in knowing how schools teach what they deem to be academic knowledge. In other words, we are interested in both the content of what is taught to black students, as well as the methodologies that are used in teaching them. Now, I want to elaborate on why black students speak about decolonization in a supposedly free and independent country. I mean, we're supposed to be decolonized. Although the political system of apartheid officially ended in 1994, racism, white supremacy, and the most sophisticated mechanics of colonialism continue to be characteristic features of many public institutions in our country. One of the most powerful social institutions characterized by this is the university and the overall education system with its curriculum, from primary right up to tertiary. As part of the social institutions inherited from the colonial past, contemporary schools are not exempt from racism and issues of power, but they are rather spaces, sites, and locations in which white supremacist ideologies, practices, hierarchies, and stereotypes about Africans continue to find fertile ground to grow and to reproduce. Basically, all ideas, philosophies, and theories, generally all systems of learning and knowing in the educational curriculum have a Eurocentric, historical, and cultural base. Consequently, contemporary scholarship continues to dismiss African epistemologies and African indigenous knowledge systems in general as being non-academic and unscientific at least, or superstitious and backwards at worst. This systematic intellectual debasement of African epistemology and the subsequent construction of Africa as a toddler consumer of Eurocentric ideas and philosophies has become standardized. It is normal. Africans remain thoroughly erased and silenced. This systematic erasure, defacing, and silencing has become our way of life. Although the African historian, anthropologist, and physicist, Dr. Anta Diop, argued that, and I quote, "The history of Black Africa will remain suspended in air and cannot be written correctly until African historians dare to connect it with the history of Egypt." Contemporary scholarship, however, continues to fail to make this essential connection. Greece and Rome, essentially, Europeans are still the primary epistemological frames of reference in the academia, not Egypt, not Africans. It is against this stark reality, informed by the historical experience of the colonial conquest of African people and their own experiences within the system, that the current black students critique this current education system and the academic curriculum taught in schools as colonial, Eurocentric, racist, and generally white supremacist. This kind of education socializes black students into accepting white supremacy as the norm and the ultimate reality. It is basically what Dr. Carter G. Woodson called a process of miseducation. Through the schooling system, our people are taught that Europeans, their ideas, their experiences, their worldviews and social constructs are superior. They are said to be scientific and universal. A case in point here are the most glorified intellectual scholars of what I call white supremacy, like Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Engels, Max Weber, Emily Durkheim, Hegel, Rousseau, Gramsci, Foucault, Marx, and the list is endless. In the academy, these scholars are glorified as scientific thinkers and authorities in the areas of values, ethics, economics, psychology, philosophy, and political sciences. And it is as though Africans or any other people other than Europeans never contributed anything worthwhile in terms of scholarship, thought, or theory. African students are made to believe that they contributed nothing or very little in these areas of human development. We never hear of Neket, the ancestral scribe, and his artist sister Tau, who were both teachers of values, principles, and ethics long before these European scholars. We hear nothing of Tau Haramanuba, called Tot Hermes by the Greek, the divine writer and teacher of law and justice in ancient Kemet, thousands of years before the birth of Greece. We hear nothing of Osa and Oset, who are called Osiris and Isis by the Greek, who made the cultivation of humanizing values a permanent aim of the arts and sciences. In the fields of theology, we hear nothing of the Kemetic origins, of the concept of Immaculate Conception, and the Christian Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, which in Kemet was the Father, represented by Osa or Osiris, the Mother, represented by Oset or Isis, and the Son, represented by Heru, known as Horus. We hear nothing of Tahotep, Kagemi, Ani, Neferti, whose works were all concerned with philosophy and political science. This is academic imperialism. It is the intellectual colonization of African minds. Just as racism and the military land dispossession of African people have become normalized subjects of the perceived past, so too has the Eurocentric intellectual and academic onslaught against African people become a norm. An African-centered education will empower African people to stop intellectual outsourcing of European concepts, ideas, worldviews, philosophies, and basically their socio-economic and political systems. But what do we mean by centered? Centered means being well-grounded in the history, the culture, and the understanding of African people. It relates to being well-grounded in African people's philosophical worldviews. Dr. Maulana Karenga states that an Afrocentric approach is essentially intellectual inquiry, and production centered on and in the image and interest of the African people. As Black students, we are calling for an African-centered education, particularly the centering of Kemetic or ancient Egyptian knowledge systems in the educational curriculum. Many of the critical challenges within our education system today are rooted in the systematic imposition of Eurocentric epistemologies on African students and people at large to perpetuate the idea that Europe is superior and Africans have never produced anything, and therefore we have to consume whatever comes from Europe. In the interest of time, I will cut some of this stuff. For education to be meaningful and to deal with the contemporary challenges that we are facing as African people, the Eurocentric curriculum must be dismantled and an African-centered epistemology must be adopted. and implicit within this framework of an Afrocentric epistemology is the idea of the liberation of African minds. The project of decolonization of the continent can only be achieved through the transformation of the mindset of Africans to appreciate the history of their classical ancient civilizations like Kemet, Nubia, Mali, Songhai, Ghana, Monomotapa, and the ancient Karanga Empire. African universities must acknowledge that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, but also the cradle of all the intellectual and scientific disciplines of the world. Academics and scholars, and indeed African people in general, must construct new African-centered pedagogy and demonstrate its practical value in dismantling of the racist, Eurocentric colonial education system. And in conclusion, in order for us Africans to exist, in order for us to be, and in order for us to become, we must think from an African center. This is what the student movement is calling for. And this is what we want our education system to teach in the classrooms, from primary right up to tertiary. The history of Africa's classical civilizations, the African origins of philosophy, science, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, engineering, mathematics, medicine, physics, and writing systems. All these subjects must be taught from an African-centered paradigm. Historic material and academic information detailing Black contributions to modern science and technological inventions and innovations must be taught in schools. And just to name some of the scholars that we want, their books must be in every library in our schools. Dr. Amos Wilson, Chancellor Williams, Dr. Ben Yokanan, Dr. Francis Cress-Wilson, Marimba Ani, John Andrew Clark, George G.M. James, Ivan Van Septima, Tony Martin, Amy Jakes Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Chik Anta Diop, Bantu Biko, Marcus Garvey, Mzwake Anton Lembede, Mulefi Kente Asante. We want all these scholars to be taught in our schools. This is what we mean when we call for an African-centered education in Azania. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely presentation.
Thando, I thought it was very interesting, your presentation, in a couple of regards, and in some ways seems third wave. So post-1994, it seemed as if we talked a lot about transformation and simply having more Black people doing the same things white people have been doing. In this current wave, as we talk about decolonization, it seems like we're looking more at the content of the curriculum, which is also very important. But it seems like you've taken it further, and I'd like you to comment a bit about it a little more, just in terms of the mode of education and even the idea of the institution of a school. And I think that's important because a lot of the research is showing that globally, young people do not learn well in the current institution known as the school. And some of that has been linked to the fact that what we know as a contemporary school is actually linked to the Industrial Revolution. And the idea that schools were places in which young people were tamed, that they were taught discipline, so they'd clock in, they'd clock out, they'd be good for the military service and good for the factory, but not necessarily good for broader thinking. In terms of your research and also the work of the Africentrik reading group, have you done more research or thought more about what form of schooling would best serve not only African children, but could also be a model for children globally? If you could comment on that a little bit, please.
And really, to be honest, as the Africentrik study group, we also, this is a question that we're also still trying to think about. In terms of what kind of an education system that we really desire for African people. Because as you rightfully said, the current education system has been, inherited from the Industrial Revolution. We've inherited it from our colonial past and that sort of thing. So we're trying to look in Africa, how was education in Africa pre-colonialism, before the coming of the invasion and everything else that came. And we have looked in Kemet specifically because, as you saw during the presentation, in Kemet we usually know of Egypt as the land of the pyramids, but most of us don't know that there were temples in ancient Egypt, and those temples were not just church temples, but those were education institutions. And in ancient Kemet, education was not compartmentalized, into departments of this and that. It was a holistic system where people studied for decades to pass through the system. Like some of the Greek scholars have spoken about, they spent more than 2 decades, 20 years in ancient Egypt studying. People like Pythagoras, And so I think this is what we're trying to look at, and we still have not found any, answers to it. But it's something that we are constantly researching, and it's something that we are thinking about as the Africentrik study group.